On November 30th, 2021, an apparently ordinary teenager walked into Oxford High School in the United States, armed and determined to commit a massacre. Ethan Crumbley took the lives of 4 students and severely wounded 7 others, sending shockwaves throughout the nation. But what drives a 15-year-old boy to commit such an atrocity? In this video, you'll uncover shocking details about Ethan's disturbing journey, dive deep into his unsettling behavior leading up to the crime, and learn how clear and alarming warning signs were tragically ignored by those who could have prevented this disaster. Get ready, because Ethan Crumbley's story isn't only about a horrific crime. It's about human failures, overlooked warnings, and most of all, the thin line between a troubled teenager and a mass murderer. Stick around until the end, because what you're about to discover may completely change the way you view this case. It was a cold, seemingly ordinary winter morning, Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, at Oxford High School in Oxford Township, Michigan. Students arrived at school, as usual, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Around 10 a.m., the calm and routine atmosphere would transform into a nightmare marked by fear, chaos, and despair. At around 10 a.m., Ethan Crumbley, then just 15 years old, entered the school as he did every day. However, this time, carefully concealed inside his backpack was a 9mm Sig Sauer semi-automatic pistol that had been purchased by his father just days before. He walked through the crowded hallways, blending in among classmates who had no idea of the dark intentions consuming his mind. Minutes later, the school's apparent normality would be shattered by the sound of gunshots echoing through the corridors. At exactly 12:51 p.m., Crumbley pulled out his weapon and began firing randomly. Those were intense and devastating minutes. The first fatal victim was struck almost immediately, and as the sound of gunshots echoed through the school, students and teachers frantically scrambled to hide behind desks, doors, and improvised barricades. Amid the panic, some students initially thought it was merely a drill or a macabre prank, failing at first to grasp the gravity of the situation. The shooting lasted approximately 5 minutes, minutes that felt like an eternity to those living through the terrifying moment. During this brief interval, Ethan fired more than 30 rounds, killing 4 students and injuring 7 others, some critically. Videos captured by cell phones showed terrifying scenes. Students hiding in classrooms, teachers desperately trying to keep students calm while calling for help, and hallways that moments earlier were full of life and youthful laughter, now scenes of pain and despair. Local police were swiftly alerted, and within 5 minutes of the first shots, security forces arrived on scene. Ethan was apprehended without resistance at 12:56 p.m., still inside the school, with unused ammunition and a warm gun in his hands. During his arrest, he offered neither explanations nor resistance, just an unsettling silence. Police immediately activated protocols to aid victims and secure the building. Within hours, the tragedy had reached national and international headlines, and the quiet town of Oxford Township had become yet another site of a school gun tragedy in America. Questions quickly emerged. How could nobody have noticed? Which signals had been overlooked? And above all, how could an apparently ordinary teenager have planned and carried out something so horrific? This timeline isn't merely a cold sequence of objective facts. It profoundly marks lives and raises painful reflections about prevention, responsibility, and society's role in noticing and intervening when something is clearly wrong. As we move forward in this video, we'll discover that the Oxford High School massacre wasn't merely an isolated event, but rather a tragedy foreseen, filled with signs that, tragically, were ignored until it was too late. To understand what led Ethan Crumbley to commit one of the most shocking school massacres in recent U.S. history, we need to go beyond the day of crime. We need to look back and trace the profile of a young man who, to many, seemed ordinary, but behind his seemingly shy and quiet demeanor hid a storm waiting to explode. Ethan was born in 2006 into a household that, at first glance, didn't stand out for anything in particular. His parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, appear to be a typical middle-class American couple. However, later investigations would reveal an unstable home environment, marked by neglect, lack of communication, and emotional abandonment. Ethan was not an outgoing child. On the contrary, he was introverted, reserved, and spent hours alone, often immersed in video games, dark drawings, and disturbing notes. At school, Ethan wasn't popular, but he wasn't a constant target of bullying either. Some classmates described him as weird or too quiet. Teachers reported communication difficulties and a distant look in his eyes, as if he were always somewhere else. There are no records of fights, but also no signs of social integration. Loneliness was a constant in his life, and over time, it became a dangerous fuel for his unbalanced mind. Later reports revealed that Ethan had been showing clear signs of psychological distress. Drawings of weapons, phrases like "the thoughts won't stop," and "blood everywhere" started to appear in his notebooks. In his school essays, he expressed dark, violent, and disturbing ideas. Still, those around him responded with indifference. His parents, in particular, downplayed the severity of the situation, treating the evidence as mere artistic expression or typical teenage angst. Even more alarming was the purchase of the weapon used in the crime. Just 4 days before the massacre, James Crumbley bought the 9mm pistol as a gift for Ethan, something the teenager proudly shared on social media, calling it "my new toy." His mother, Jennifer, even took him to a shooting range to practice. In light of what followed, this act reveals a terrifying level of parental negligence and emotional disconnection from their son's reality. On the morning of the massacre, Ethan was actually called into the school office, along with his parents. His teachers had found the alarming drawings, and the school considered the matter serious enough to involve them. Yet, instead of taking their son home, the parents insisted that he stay at school. The content of the drawings? Guns, blood, phrases like "life is meaningless." Still, no one took concrete action. No backpack was searched. No safety measures were taken. This is Ethan Crumbley, a young man whose cries for help were ignored, whose pain was silenced, and whose quiet isolation turned into lethal rage. More than just the portrait of a killer, Ethan represents a distorted reflection of a society that often only sees the problem when it's far too late. As we continue through this video, we'll dive deeper into how the failure to recognize Ethan's silent screams directly contributed to the tragedy that followed. If there's one thing that makes the Ethan Crumbley case even more disturbing, it's the fact that the tragedy wasn't a bolt out of the blue. On the contrary, it was preceded by a series of clear, alarming, and documented warning signs. Signs that, if taken seriously, could have completely changed the outcome of that bloody morning. The Oxford High School massacre didn't begin with the first gunshots. It began long before, in the pages of a notebook, in the overlooked behaviors, in the empty stares that no one questioned. About 2 weeks before the shooting, Ethan began to display even more evident behavioral changes. Classmates reported that he was more withdrawn, quieter than usual, and he was already a naturally introverted figure. What no one knew was that, during that same period, he was writing and drawing disturbing scenes in his school notebook. Images of people bleeding, guns, bullets piercing bodies, and phrases like "the thoughts won't stop, blood everywhere, help me." These drawings weren't hidden away in a bedroom or secret journal. They were right there, in the hands of teachers, under the school's watchful eye. On November 29th, a teacher reported unusual behavior from Ethan in class. The next morning, just hours before the shooting, another teacher found the alarming drawings and messages. This triggered an internal alert, and his parents were called in for an emergency meeting. At 10 a.m. that morning, Ethan and his parents sat with school administrators. The staff presented the drawings, voiced serious concerns, and suggested that the boy be taken for psychological evaluation as soon as possible. But here comes one of the most controversial and shocking decisions in the entire case. The parents refused. They insisted that Ethan wasn't a threat and asked that he be allowed to return to class. The school, in turn, also failed, allowing him to stay without checking his backpack, without any security measure. Just an hour and a half after that conversation, Ethan was in the hallway, armed and ready to shoot. How do we explain this? How did so many adults, parents, teachers, administrators, look at that material and do nothing more than express mild concern? Was it fear of overreacting, negligence, or worse, a collective failure to recognize that a young person can also carry a silent, dangerous kind of pain? Beyond the drawings, Ethan had also shown digital warning signs. His search history included ammunition, firearms, and mass shootings. Messages sent to classmates carried a dark tone, phrases that could be seen as veiled threats, but no one took them seriously. In fact, just days before the shooting, his mother texted him, "I'm not mad at you for looking up ammo. You just have to be more discreet." That kind of communication didn't just downplay the risk, it practically encouraged the behavior. At school, Ethan was invisible, but his silence was screaming for anyone willing to listen. And yet, no one heard. Or worse, they heard, but chose not to act. What this case exposes is a terrifying pattern: society's tendency to normalize red flags. We fail to recognize that the behavior of a young person in emotional distress can spiral into something extreme. It's not about demonizing a teenager. It's about understanding that prevention begins long before the trigger is ever pulled. These ignored signs weren't just tragic oversights. They were missed opportunities to interrupt the cycle. They were critical moments that, if handled with seriousness, could have saved 4 lives, spared dozens of others from trauma, and prevented a town from carrying scars that may never fade. And as we continue through this video, one question becomes impossible to avoid: how many other Ethans are silently crying for help right now, while no one is listening? When a crime like Ethan Crumbley's happens, the initial focus is usually on the shooter. But as investigations unfold, much more uncomfortable questions begin to emerge. Who should have stopped this? Who saw the signs, had the power and the duty to act, but did nothing? In this case, 2 groups stand out: the family and the school. And both failed. Let's start with the parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley. They lived with Ethan in a modest home in Oxford Township, and, from the outside, appeared to be a typical family. But behind closed doors, the truth was different. The couple faced financial struggles, unstable relationships with co-workers, and a recurring pattern of emotional neglect. Jennifer, the mother, kept a blog where she vented about the challenges of being a mom and her lack of connection with her son. Instead of seeking help or trying to understand what was going on, she expressed frustration. Not understanding, not empathy, frustration. And then comes one of the most outrageous aspects of the entire story. The murder weapon was legally purchased by the father as an early Christmas present for Ethan. Just 4 days before the massacre, they went to the store together, and James bought the 9mm pistol used in the attack. Ethan was thrilled and posted a photo of his new toy on social media. Jennifer took him to the shooting range. Instead of recognizing they were placing a deadly weapon in the hands of a deeply troubled teenager, they romanticized the gesture as if it were a healthy hobby, a distraction for tough days. But it wasn't. When the first warning signs appeared at school, the disturbing drawings, the alarming notes, Ethan's parents were immediately called in for a meeting. And again, they failed. During the meeting with school officials, the staff presented Ethan's worrying sketches and strongly suggested that he be taken home and referred for psychological evaluation. But the parents refused. They claimed they didn't have time that day and insisted that Ethan be allowed to return to class. The most shocking part? They knew about the gun. They knew it was in his possession. And still, they left him there alone with a backpack on his back and a storm raging inside his head. But the responsibility doesn't lie with them alone. The school also failed deeply. Even after seeing violent drawings and suicidal and homicidal messages, they did not search Ethan's backpack. There was no call to the police, no emergency safety measures. The school chose to trust vague reassurances from the parents, ignoring basic safety protocols. It was as if everyone saw the fire starting, but decided to wait and see how far it would spread. And by the time they realized, it was too late. Some argue that the school was limited by system rules, that they couldn't act without parental consent. But in the face of such glaring warning signs, was inaction truly the only option? Wasn't there a counselor, a social worker, or a security protocol that could justify, at the very least, keeping Ethan out of the classroom until it was clear he posed no threat? What's terrifying about this case is the chain of omissions. Parents who ignored silent screams, who treated guns like toys, who refused to see their son's pain. Educators who hesitated to act, even when the evidence was overwhelming. A school that failed to protect its students. A system that collapsed in silence. Ethan Crumbley pulled the trigger, but the road to that moment was paved by adults who had the power to change the outcome, and didn't. The role of the parents and the school cannot be overlooked, because in the end, when we look at the Oxford High School tragedy, we don't just see a teenager with a gun. We see a chain of failures. We see the cost of negligence. And we see, with deep sadness, that this tragedy could have been prevented. The massacre committed by Ethan Crumbley did not end with his arrest. On the contrary, it was only the beginning of a series of legal, moral, and social consequences that continue to echo to this day. Unlike many other school shootings in the United States, where the shooter takes their own life or is killed during the confrontation with police, Ethan was captured alive, in silence, and without resistance. This allowed for something rare: full judicial accountability, not just for him, but for those around him. Immediately after his arrest, Ethan was charged as an adult. At just 15 years old, he faced 24 charges, including first-degree murder, terrorism, and attempted homicide. The use of the terrorism charge drew attention from legal experts and the general public. For the first time, a school shooting was being legally framed not only as a crime against the direct victims, but as an attack on an entire traumatized community. The prosecution wanted to send a clear message. The psychological terror caused by Ethan spread far beyond the bullets. It affected hundreds of students, teachers, and families who would never be the same. Meanwhile, Ethan's trial revealed even more disturbing details about how he prepared for the massacre. Diaries, videos, online searches. Everything pointed to a meticulous and deliberate plan. This was not a moment of impulsive rage. He plotted, he wrote, he rehearsed in his mind. And even with all this laid bare, he showed no remorse. According to reports, he remained cold, apathetic, as if he had emotionally disconnected from the world long before the crime ever took place. But what truly made this case a turning point in the American justice system was something unprecedented. Ethan's parents were also charged with involuntary manslaughter. James and Jennifer Crumbley became the first parents in U.S. history to face this type of charge in a school shooting. According to the prosecution, they weren't just negligent. They were part of the machinery that allowed the tragedy to happen. They bought the gun. They ignored the signs. They refused help. They let their son continue as if nothing was wrong, even after desperate warnings. The defense tried to argue that the parents couldn't have foreseen what Ethan would do. They claimed they trusted him and didn't believe he was capable of something so extreme. But the evidence was brutal. Text messages between them, the gun purchase, the ignored drawings, their decisions on the morning of the massacre. Everything pointed to a pattern of omission so severe that, according to the prosecution, it bordered on indirect encouragement. The trial gained national attention and sparked heated debate. How far does a parent's responsibility go for their child's actions? At what point does the system fail by not placing stricter limits on minors' access to firearms? And how should society respond when all the warning signs were there, but treated as background noise? The court's decision to pursue charges against the parents sent a clear message. Turning a blind eye is no longer acceptable. If you contribute to the making of a tragedy, even through omission, you will be held accountable. It sets a new legal and moral precedent. This isn't just about punishment. It's about recognizing that lives were lost because many wrong decisions were made, one after the other. As for Ethan, he awaits final sentencing and is expected to receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. The coldness with which he carried out the crime, the brutality of his actions, and the methodical planning all make it nearly impossible to argue insanity or show genuine remorse. The Crumbley case has left deep scars, but it also marks an attempt at change. Justice, though too late for the victims, is trying to show that every omission comes at a cost, that it's not enough to recognize danger. We must act before it manifests. Because when the system fails, as it did in Oxford, the price is paid in blood, trauma, and lives that can never be brought back. When the sirens fade, the hallways are cleaned, the headlines move on, and social media stops commenting. What's left? What remains after a tragedy like the one that occurred at Oxford High School? More than grief and statistics. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths and urgently reflect on the failures that allowed it to happen. The first major lesson is brutal in its simplicity. The signs were there. Clear, loud, repeated. Ethan Crumbley didn't snap out of nowhere. He was ignored, minimized, dehumanized. His violent drawings, his extreme isolation, his disturbing messages, all of it was screaming for help. But he was treated as just another weird teenager. And that exposes a systemic failure that extends far beyond the halls of Oxford. Society's chronic inability to deal with psychological suffering in youth. We live in a culture that romanticizes resilience, that glorifies pushing through, but is woefully unprepared to confront real, deep, silent pain. We expect teens to be unstable, rebellious, confused. But when that pain crosses the threshold of what's bearable, the system often turns its back. Ethan was invisible until the day he became a monster in the eyes of the world. But he had been broken long before he ever pulled the trigger. The second lesson is even more unsettling. Responsibility is not just individual. The narrative that he was the culprit, end of story, is comforting but superficial. This case reveals a chain of negligence. Parents who didn't see or refused to. Educators who recognized the problem but hesitated to act. A school that chose to trust appearances instead of following safety protocols. A legal system that only woke up when bodies were already on the ground. And if you think this is something distant from your reality, think again. How many Ethans do you know? How many young people around you are living in silence, trapped in a world of pain no one tries to reach? How many warning signs have you already seen and ignored because it was just easier that way? Another crucial reflection lies in the gun debate. In the United States, easy access to firearms intersects with a culture of extreme individualism. But when a 15-year-old child has access to a pistol purchased by his own parents, and that's treated as normal, we need to ask, where's the line between personal freedom and reckless endangerment? At what point does the right to own a weapon override the safety of an entire community? We also learned that inaction has consequences. In the Crumbley case, it cost lives. Literally. The silence of the adults around Ethan became an accomplice to the tragedy. And that forces us to reconsider the idea that doing nothing is a neutral stance. It's not. In the face of suffering, imminent violence, or someone else's pain, silence is a choice. And that choice has a price. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all is the simplest and the most forgotten. We need to start seeing each other as human beings again. We need to truly look at one another, even those who seem strange, withdrawn, disconnected. Because behind every silence, behind every distant stare, there may be someone crying for help. And if we don't extend a hand, who will? The Oxford High School massacre wasn't just a crime. It was a collective scream for awareness. A brutal reminder that we are failing our youth. And that if nothing changes, this won't be the last time we mourn lives lost to a tragedy that could and should have been prevented. The Ethan Crumbley case is not just another tragic episode in a long list of school shootings. It is, in fact, a brutal portrait of collective failure. When we look at everything revealed here, the ignored signs, the parents' negligence, the school's inaction, the system's silence, we're not just witnessing a crime, but a tragedy built step by step, fueled by neglect, by the normalization of danger, and by blindness in the face of the obvious. Ethan pulled the trigger, but how many others pressed the button of indifference long before that? The story you've just watched is not only about a teenager and 4 lost lives. It's about hundreds of people who will never be the same again. About an entire town that learned the hardest way that choosing not to act is still a choice. and one that comes at high cost. And it's impossible not to wonder how many other tragedies are silently brewing at this very moment. Inside classrooms, behind quiet doors, in confused minds that are begging for help without knowing how to ask. If this story struck a chord with you, don't let it pass as just another true crime video. Share this message. Leave a comment below. Do you think this tragedy could have been prevented? At what point could everything have changed? Your opinion matters, and it might open someone else's eyes. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and hit the like button if this content made you reflect. Here, we don't just tell stories of crime. We dive deep into the causes, the consequences, and, most importantly, the uncomfortable truths that many prefer to ignore. Because as long as stories like Ethan Crumbley's continue to exist, silence is not an option.